The tracks ran into the mountain and did not come out, or so it looked from below, because where they reached the steep flank of the peak they ran in under a long, low roof of timber and were gone, swallowed into a dark that went on and on along the mountainside. And she stood in the snow at the mouth of it in the last gray light, and understood that the tracks had not gone into the mountain, but under a shed, a snow shed, one of the long timber tunnels the mountain railroads built over their lines in the high avalanche country to keep the winter off the rails, and that the shed ran on along the flank of the peak for she could not see how far. A covered road under the snow, dark and dry and out of the weather. She had heard of such things, and never seen one, and she stood at the mouth a moment in something like wonder at the scale of it, at the labor a railroad had once spent to keep a few miles of rail clear of a mountain that wanted to bury them, and then the cold and the failing light decided her, and she went in, because the weather was coming and the shed was shelter, and because a covered mile of abandoned railroad was exactly the kind of long, dark question she had spent her life walking into. She was 18 years old, and she carried the whole of what she owned on her back, 30 pounds of it, the folding knife and the matches in the bread bag and the tin cup and the candle stub and the soft notebook with the pencil and the little under $9 folded in the back that she had not needed to spend in some days. She went in out of the failing light and the snow into the shed, and it closed over her, a long timber gallery built of great posts and beams and a roof that came down steep on the uphill side, the mountainside, so that the whole shed leaned into the slope like a shoulder set against it, and the light came in gray bars through the gaps in the downhill wall where the timbers had shrunk, and the rails ran on ahead of her into the dark, rust-red and straight, and the snow that had blown in through the gaps lay in long drifts along the downhill side. She stood a moment just inside the mouth and read the shed the way she read all such places, by what it was and how it was made. It was old and enormous work, the shed, a thing built at a cost she could hardly reckon. Mile on mile of great squared timber raised in that killing country to keep a few rails clear of the winter, and she could see the cunning of it even at a glance, the way the whole roof was pitched to the slope, low and steep on the uphill side where it met the mountain and lifting to the open downhill side, a great long wedge set into the flank of the peak, and she felt the strange safety of it. The deep, dry stillness under the timber with the storm shut outside, a made cave a mile long, and she liked it, the way she liked all the long, dark-made places, for the shelter and the secrecy and the question of what waited at the far end. It was dry in there, and still, and out of the wind, and she walked in along the rails into the deepening dark with her candle not yet lit, letting her eyes learn the gray, and she went a long way in, a quarter mile and more, the mouth of the shed shrinking to a gray coin behind her, and it was there, deep in the shed, in a bay where the drifted snow had come in deep and half buried the rails, that she found the caboose. It stood on the rails where it had been left, a caboose, the little house car that had ridden at the end of the old freights, and the blown snow of many winters had drifted up around it and over it until it was half buried, a red car going to gray under a white drift that had come in through the shrunken wall and heaped against it and over its roof, so that it sat in the shed like a thing sinking into the snow in slow motion, its lower half drowned in the drift, its cupola. The little raised lookout box on its roof where the trainman had sat to watch the train ahead, standing up out of the snow like the wheelhouse of a foundering boat. She stood and looked at it a while in the gray dark before she went to it, at the drowned red car deep in the mountain's shed, and it seemed to her the loneliest and most beautiful thing she had found in all her walking, a whole small home carried up into the high country at the end of a train, and left there when the train did not come back, sinking slow into the snow that blew in year on year, waiting under the timber a mile from any daylight. And she felt for it the way you feel for a thing that has been left, a tenderness, before she even knew that it had been kept. And in the window of it, deep in the buried car, small and warm and steady in the gray dark of the shed, there was a light. She stood in the drifted snow of the shed and looked at the light in the buried caboose and felt the lift her heart had learned to give. And she did not, by now, waste any while wondering whether it was a living hand, because she knew the steady patient light of a kept place from the moving light of an occupied one, and this was the first, and she waded to it through the drift that had half buried the car. The lower door was under the snow, but the drift itself made a ramp up the side of the car to where the snow had heaped against the door at the platform end, and she climbed the drift and came to the door on the little end platform of the caboose, iron-handled, its handle worn bright in the middle of the rust by a hand that had used it, and she worked it, and the door came, and warm air fell out around her, smelling of coal smoke and tallow and old paper and the particular oiled wood smell of an old railroad car, and she stepped in off the snow-buried platform into the caboose. And she was not the first. The inside of the caboose was a whole small house, because that was what a caboose had always been, a house on wheels for the men who lived on the train, and someone had kept it as one. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes take it, the little iron stove in its corner with its rail around it to hold the pots in the sway of the road, cold now but banked, its coals deep, the bunks built into the walls, made up with blankets, the lockers and the fold-down table, the conductor's desk with its pigeonholes, and up a little ladder at the center, the cupola, the raised lookout with its bench seats and its windows on four sides, though the windows now looked out on nothing but the packed snow of the drift that had buried the car to the cupola's sills. She loved it at once, more quickly than she had loved any of the places, because it asked nothing of her that the others had asked, no making over, no fitting a life into a machine or a stone. It was already a home, had been born a home, small and tight and complete, every foot of it made to be lived in by people who had nowhere else to live but the train. And she saw her whole life in the shape of it, a house built for people who moved, a home for the homeless made to roll down the endless rails, and it seemed to her the most fitting place she had ever walked into. A home for a drifter built by a railroad that understood, better than most, that some people live on the road. It was the completest home she had found, because it had been built to be a home and had needed no making over, only keeping, and someone had kept it. The brasses rubbed, the bunks made, the stove banked. Everything in the tight ship-shape order of a car that a man had lived in and loved, under the fine, even dust of a place shut up a long time. She lit the lantern, and the caboose came warm and wooden and golden around her, the snow packed gray-white against the windows on every side, a buried red car with a lit and living heart, and on the fold-down desk, weighted under a railroad spike gone to rust, there was a book, and she took it up and read it, because the book was the kindness, and the book was the rule. And she had learned in 7 hard places never to sleep in a stranger's house without first reading the thing the stranger left to be read. He had been the snow-shed watchman, the keeper of the shed, and he had tended it for the whole of his life. He wrote of it in a plain, blunt hand, the work of keeping a snow-shed, which was harder and more dangerous than she would have guessed, the walking of the long timber gallery in all weathers, the watching of it against the 3 things that kill a snow-shed and the trains beneath it, the fire. For it was all dry timber and a spark could take a mile of it. The snow load. For a roof could take only so much before it broke. And above all the slide, the avalanche, for the shed stood where it stood for one reason only, that the mountain above it shed its snow in great slides down chutes that crossed the line, and the shed was built to take those slides, its steep uphill roof set at the angle of the slope so that a slide coming down would run up over the roof and across and on down the mountain below, passing over the sheltered rails like water over a fish's back, and the trains beneath would come through untouched under a mile of thundering snow. He wrote of the great slides he had seen in his 40 years, the winters the whole mountain seemed to come down, the roar of it and the way the shed took it and held. And of the pride he felt each time the shed shrugged the mountain over and stood, the men on the train that came through after never knowing that the snow of half a peak had passed over their heads while they played cards in the warm. He had loved the shed for that. The great cunning of it. A building made to be buried and survive. To take the mountain's whole weight of snow and shrug it over and stand, and he had kept it. Walking it, mending its roof, clearing its drains, watching the chutes above for the slides for a lifetime. And when the line closed and the train stopped and there was no more traffic to shelter, he had not gone. Because he could not, he wrote, make himself leave a shed he had kept for 40 years to rot and fall, and let the mountain finally have the rails he had spent his life keeping open, and so he had stayed, in the caboose that the last freight had left behind in the shed, and made it his home, and kept the shed, for no trains and no wage, because the keeping was the thing he was. And he wrote about the slide, because the slide was the danger, the great danger, and he set the rule apart in the middle of a page, with a line ruled above and below the way they all did. The shed will take the slide, but only where it is whole. The deep bays are armored and true and will shed the mountain. But the ends are open, and the third bay from the lower end has a rotted roof I could never. Rightly mend when you hear the mountain let go, and you will know the sound, a crack like the sky breaking, and then a growing roar. Do not run out. Never run out into it, but get to the caboose, in the deep armored bay, and stay low and ride it over. The shed will hold where it is whole, and you must be where it is whole. The drifter girl read that 3 times, and she understood the whole terrible cunning of it, the shed built to be buried and survive, and the one weak place in it, the rotted third bay the watchman could never mend, and the deadly wrong instinct the rule named. The instinct to run out from under a roof you feel the mountain falling on, which was the very thing that would kill you. Because outside was the slide, and inside, in the right place, was the one safe thing in all the mountain. It was the same shape she had met in every place, she saw, the danger and the deliverance the same fact seen 2 ways. The shed that the avalanche would bury was the shed that the avalanche would pass over. If you were where it was whole. The roof the mountain fell on was the roof that shrugged the mountain off, if you were in the deep bay, and the one thing that stood between the two was knowing, the rule, the stranger's warning that turned you from the killing instinct to the saving discipline. And this rule, she thought, asked the hardest thing of any of them, because the others had asked her to do a hard thing in a frightening moment, but not to override her own deepest animal knowledge, and this one did exactly that, asked her to run toward the falling mountain and not away from it, to trust a dead man's page over the oldest instinct a body has, and she wondered, reading it, whether she would be able to, when the moment came, whether the rule would hold against that much instinct, and she did not know, and she was afraid of not knowing, and she marked it the harder for the fear. She found the caboose stood, she saw with relief, in a deep bay, one of the whole and armored ones, well up the shed from the rotted third bay at the lower end, in the strongest part of the shed the watchman had chosen for exactly its strength. And she understood that he had parked his home in the safest bay of the shed, the way a careful person picks the safest corner of a dangerous room, and that in choosing it he had chosen for her too, without knowing her, the safe place she would need. She marked in her mind where the rotted third bay was, down toward the lower mouth, and she resolved to keep well clear of it. And she banked the good stove and lay down in a made bunk in the buried caboose, with the snow packed gray against the windows, and slept, warm and dry and deep in the mountain shed, and she did not yet know the sound the watchman meant, but she knew to fear it, and knowing to fear it was enough for the first night. The slide came on the 9th day, and she heard the sound, and it was exactly as he had written it, and the writing of it saved her. There had been a great fall of snow for 2 days, and then a warming, the dangerous warming that loosens the snow on the high slopes and sets it ready to run, and she had felt the change in the air without knowing to name it. A heaviness, a wet weight to the cold, the very sign the watchman's ledger had warned of, and she had not yet learned to read as warning. And she had been down the shed from the caboose that afternoon, down toward the lower mouth gathering the dry deadfall that blew in there for her stove, working nearer the lower end than she liked, but the wood was there, when the mountain let go. She heard it first as the watchman had written. A crack, a single enormous crack from high above and behind the shed, like the sky breaking. A sound so big and so wrong that her whole body knew it before her mind did, the sound he had promised she would know, and she knew it in her spine before she had a word for it, and then the roar began. A growing thunder that came down the mountain toward the shed, and she understood in one cold plunge what it was. The slide, the avalanche, coming down the chute onto the shed. And she understood in the same instant where she was, down near the lower mouth, near the rotted third bay, in the weak place, in the wrong place. And every animal thing in her wanted to run out the near lower mouth into the open, out from under the roof the mountain was falling on. Because that is what the body knows, that when a roof is about to come down, you get out from under it. Get to the open. Get to the sky, and the open and the sky were right there, a few strides out the near mouth, and her legs wanted to take her there, and the rule came up in her cold and clear over the panic and the pull of it. Do not run out. Never run out. Get to the caboose in the deep armored bay, and she did not run out. She ran in, against every screaming instinct, against the whole animal weight of her own terror telling her the open was safety. She turned her back on the near mouth and the open sky, and ran up the shed into the dark, into the mountain, toward the deep bay and the caboose, running up the rails as the roar grew behind and above her into a thing that filled the whole world, her lungs tearing and her legs driving, and the one thought the rule had given her held against everything her body screamed. In, not out, in, not out, and she reached the caboose and threw herself up the drift and through the door and down onto the floor of it in the deep armored bay just as the slide came onto the shed. It came over the shed like the end of the world. The roar became a weight, the whole mountain of snow coming down the chute and onto the steep uphill roof and running up it and over, a thundering river of snow crossing the shed above her, and the shed took it, the great timbers groaning and cracking under the weight, but holding, the slide running up the armored roof and over and down the mountain below, exactly as the watchman had written it would, passing over the deep bay like water over a fish's back, and she lay on the floor of the caboose in the deep bay, with her arms over her head and the whole world thundering, and felt the shed hold over her, felt the deep armored bay take the mountain's weight and stand. It seemed to go on forever, the roar and the weight, longer than a thing that big should take to pass, the snow of half a peak pouring over the shed while she lay in the dark of the buried car, and could do nothing but be small, and trust the timber and the dead man who had built his home in the strong place. And there was a moment in the middle of it when the groaning of the great beams grew so loud and so near that she was sure the bay was going, sure the roof was coming down on her after all, and she held to the floor and to the rule and did not move, because there was nowhere better to go. Because the deep bay was the best place in the mountain, and if the best place failed there was no other, and the beams groaned and held, and did not fail. And down the shed, toward the lower mouth, she heard a different sound in the roar, a rending, a collapse, the rotted third bay going in, the weak place taking the slide and failing, the roof there caving under the weight the armored bay's shed, and she understood, lying there, that if she had run out the lower mouth she would be under the slide on the open mountain and dead, and that if she had sheltered where she stood, in the weak place by the rotted bay, she would be under the collapsed roof and dead, and that the only living thing to do had been the thing every instinct fought, to run in, up the shed, into the mountain, to the deep armored bay, and that she had done it only because a man 40 years dead had written the rule that overrode her instinct, had known the slide would come for whoever kept the shed, and had written the one thing that would turn them from the killing run outward to the saving run inward, and it had turned her, a rule set apart on a page. The roar passed. The slide ran itself out down the mountain below, and the thunder drew off, and there was silence, the enormous ringing silence after. And she lay on the floor of the caboose in the deep bay and shook, and then she got up and looked. The caboose was whole. The deep bay was whole. the great armored timbers standing, dusted white with the snow that had sifted through every seam but holding true. She went to the door and could not open it far, for the slide had packed new snow against the whole shed. But she got out and went up into the cupola and looked out its snow-caked windows, wiping one clear, and saw the shed white and packed and buried, but standing all up the deep bays, and saw, down toward the lower mouth, where the roof of the third bay had caved, a wall of collapsed timber and packed avalanche snow closing the lower shed. The weak place taken at last as the watchman had always known it would be, and she understood how close it had been, the width of a rule, the difference between running out and running in. And she sat down in the cupola in the gray light and shook a while longer. And then she took up her notebook and wrote the rule first, before anything, the way she had come to do, when the mountain lets go. Do not run out, run in, to the caboose in the deep armored bay, and ride it over. She underlined it twice, and below it she wrote a second line, he kept the shed 40 years, and made sure his home stood in the strong place. For me. She looked at that a while. Then she went on. The days took on a shape. The lower mouth was closed by the slide now, the third bay caved, but the deep bays stood, and the upper mouth was open, and she kept to the strong shed and made her way in and out the upper end, and she kept the caboose and she kept the shed the way the watchman had, walking the deep bays, watching the roof, clearing the drains where the meltwater ran, and above all watching the chutes above through the cleared cupola windows for the loading of the next slide. Learning the signs the watchman's ledger taught her, the warming that loosens the snow, the wet heaviness in the air, the small hiss and settle the slope made when it was ready, so that she came to know when the mountain was ready to let go and to keep to the deep bay and the caboose in. Those days and not go down the shed at all, and she was never again caught near the weak place. She learned to read the mountain the way she had learned to read the wind in the tank and the river at the pier and the flame in the shaft, until the avalanche was not a terror that fell on her out of nowhere, but a thing she could feel coming a day off. A language she had learned. And the learning of it was the watchman's true gift, greater even than the rule, because the rule had saved her once in the crisis, and the reading would keep her from the crisis altogether. She could not mend the caved third bay, that was beyond her. But she cleared and shored what she could of the deep bay's drains and joints, keeping the strong shed strong, doing the watchman's work as far as her hands could do it. She kept the stove banked, and the brasses rubbed, and the bunks made in the tight ship-shape order the watchman had kept, because it seemed the right way to keep a caboose his way. And she drew her water from the endless snow melted on the stove, and she left untouched the small things that had been his. Out of the courtesy, she paid all of them. She never learned the whole of him. She did not expect to. But she came to know the shape of his mind by keeping his shed and his caboose and watching his chutes, and she thought that the snow-shed watchman had been the most quietly wise of all the keepers she had found, a man who had understood the deep strange thing the shed understood, that the way to survive an overwhelming force is not to resist it, but to be shaped to let it pass, to build a roof at the angle that lets the mountain run over you and go, to be buried and shrug it off and stand. She turned that over many evenings in the cupola with the white chutes above her, and she thought it was the truest thing any of the keepers had taught her, truer even than the turntable man's balance or the pier tender's letting in of the flood, though it was of a kind with those, all of them the same deep wisdom in different shapes, that the great forces of the world, the flood and the fire and the mountain, are not to be fought. For you cannot fight a mountain, but understood and given what they want, the floor to fill or the roof to run over, so that they pass and leave you standing. The watchman had built his whole last life on that, in the strong bay, in the sheltering dark, keeping a shed that was made to be buried and survive, for no trains and no wage, because the keeping was the thing he was, and she thought that a person could do worse with a life than to learn to be shaped like that shed, to let the hard things run over and go and to stand after, and that she was learning it, place by place, keeper by keeper, and that this one had taught it most plainly of all. And the drifter girl, keeping it now, understood him, the way she had come to understand all of them, and understood by now past any doubting that these places were not chance, that a girl who walks in under the long dark roofs of the world is exactly the person the keepers had kept their sheds and their caboose lights burning for. The one who would come at the last and read the rule and take up the keeping and run in, not out, when the mountain let go. On an evening in the last of the winter, she sat in the cupola of the buried caboose with the lantern lit and the watchman's ledger closed under its spike below and her own notebook open on her knee. The 4 windows of the cupola cleared now, and looking out along the dim strong shed one way and up the white chutes of the mountain the other, the deep bays standing true around her, the caved lower shed sealed off and quiet. She had come, over the winter, to love the cupola most of all the watching places she had sat in, because it was made for watching, built onto the roof of the car so the trainmen could see the length of their train, and now it let her see the length of her shed and the loading of her mountain both. And to sit up in it in the evening with the lantern low was to sit in the watchman's own seat and keep the watch he had kept, up in the little glass box on the roof of the buried car with the whole dark shed below and the whole white mountain above. The safest and most watchful place she had ever made her own. She was 18 years old. She had a folding knife, a box of matches, a tin cup, and a little under $9 she had not spent, and now had nowhere to spend, and did not miss. She had a home in a buried caboose in the deep armored bay of a snow shed, a stove and bunks, and a cupola to watch from. A rule that had turned her from the killing run into the saving one, and a book she had not written full of the quiet wisdom of a man who understood that you survive the mountain by letting it pass over you. She turned to a fresh page and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and around her the great shed stood whole in the strong bays where the watchman had built to be buried and survive, sheltering her the way it had sheltered the trains. And up the mountain the white chutes held their snow quiet for now under the last light, and she began to write, in the plain blunt hand she was learning from a snow-shed watchman 40 years dead, the first line of the keeping of the only home she had ever made her own.